Okay, welcome back to Weekend Walkabout in our gardens and years virtually. With this native and natural ground covers, and it's actually chapter 3. We finished chapter 1 and chapter 2 and had a good time this morning, but we've already been told by a number of subscribers who wrote in and said we blew it on that one. They wanted to know, Janet and Steve, which ground covers do you recommend? Well, we put a lot on the list, and I'm going to quickly go through ground covers and add this as an extra chapter, and we'll see how that works. We're coming to you from gardenaz.org. I'm Janet. Stephen is not here right now. He was here this morning, but we'll let this one go with just me talking. Neither is the chat room open, and so Sonia is not here. And if you were here earlier today, you were listening to Cheryl Bennerup helping us out with talking about the ground covers. What an incredible resource Cheryl is, a whole lifetime of growing plants professionally and on her own acres of plants that she's produced in her lifetime, and many of them wildflower ground covers. So we're going to go on to talk about native and natural ground covers. I'll be working on the list on pages 2 and 3 of what you can download from our audience materials on our website. Just go under webinars and you'll find the audience materials page, and you can find these notes for any of our webinars. So what we did this morning is we talked about plants that people wanted to talk about. And your immediate feedback from a number of people was we wanted to hear what you wanted to say, okay, or what we recommend. Everything on this list are ground covers that we have used or are considering using, are trying to use, or have seen used and like. There are a couple on here, as we talked a little bit about in the earlier chapters. There are a couple in here that they're not favorites of ours, but they do the job for one reason or another. So I'm quickly going to go through and I'll show you pictures and tell you one thing about each of these, but it's a lot of plants. So let's get going here. Starting with the first group, that's the small, short plants that are evergreen. Remembering that I'm not going to tell you about sun and shade because it's on the list. The 0 means full sun, 1 dot means best in part shade, 2 dots best in full shade. A combination of a 0 first and a dot means better to be in full sun, but it'll take part shade. And a dot and an O means prefers part shade, but can take some sun. And then of course there's a deer resistant symbol too. The natives are in bold. So we'll go through and take a look and see what these things are. We'll start with ajuga. Funny name, great ground cover plant. In chapter 1, I told you about ajuga and what it did here. This is the ajuga called Bronze Beauty, has a bit of a bronze cast to the leaf. Most of the leaves are green on ajuga, but this one, Bronze Beauty, especially the new growth, is bronze colored. There are a number of variegated ajugas, multicolorous, pink lightning. I don't find that those are stable. We like the ones that have solid leaf color, chocolate chip, Bronze Beauty, Caitlin's Giant, and we find them to be very good, reliable ground covers, able to mix it up with other short ground covers, which is fine with us. We grow a lot of things in quilts, but has a tendency, ajuga, to have, in a bad year, to die out. There is a fungus that can infect the crown, and in a bad exposed winter, it seems like they're set up for that, and so it'll die out. You can plant it again, it'll grow fine that next growing season, but come the next winter when it's stressed, it'll die out again. So if your ajuga dies out, don't just wholesale replace it. Put something else in there, let it get started. You can bring the ajuga back in again. Epimedium, or barrenwort, terrible name, barrenwort, but epimedium is this plant here that's a quasi-evergreen. Some years it's evergreen, some years it burns off all the leaves. Most years it's good to try to clip it back before it blooms so that you don't have tattered leaves to look at. But it's a good ground cover, known for growing in drier shade. I don't think that it loves dry shade, but it is a good plant to have. It is not particularly a wow plant. It's just a reliable plant. It spreads by underground runners and is most beautiful when it blooms in the spring, but the flowers are not spectacular. They're just little flowers. This is the yellow one, flavum, Epimedium flavum. And it's the best ground cover in our estimation. It is one of the shorter ones. In bloom, it's maybe 10 inches tall. Some of them are quite tall, and the flowers are more impressive, look a little bit like spiders dangling above the flowers, and they're pink or reddish, rosy colored. Some are kind of purpley colored. Those don't spread as rapidly. They don't make as much of a ground cover as the yellow one does. And fairly easy to control. Here's one of the rubrums, Epimedium rubrum, and a variety that has the pink flowers. But they're not, like I say, the best ground cover in our estimation is the one with the yellow flowers. And that's pretty much what you get through the year is just a solid cover. And because it's nearly evergreen, they're good at keeping things from germinating, even seeds from trees, for instance, from germinating in the fall. We talked about bunchberry earlier, so we're just going to go through the pictures and admire again one of our pretty natives, evergreens. Candy tuft, one of the evergreen subshrubs, which means it's a woody plant. It's not truly a perennial, like herbaceous perennial peonies. It stays above ground. It's evergreen. It's a member of the mustard family, so like many of them, it blooms in the springtime. Lots of flowers. It can be a little bit distracting to look at after it blooms because it has a lot of seed heads on it. And you can mow it off, or in this case here, weed whip it off when that happens. Roses come up between it here, roses and hibiscus. It is a good, reliable ground cover if you've got sun. And that's one of the things that you need to have is sun for candy tuft. Dead nettle, another terrible name. We just call it lamium. I think most people call it lamium. We shouldn't show you this one first, but we are. Our favorite is the one with gold leaves. It's Lamium maculatum, which means spot. It means that there's a spot of different color in the leaf. That the species has a kind of a natural variegation, but within the species, there are varieties like this yellow one, and I love it. It lights up the shade. It creeps along the ground and roots where it touches. Yeah, although it can creep outward, and like many ground covers, there's plumbago growing behind it here. Like many ground covers, it can get a little carried away with itself. It is easy, in my book, it's easy to peel it back because it's only just rooted on the surface. The yellow one is a little unstable. It'll go back to being green. There's a bit of a green part here. I can see it right there. And you have to pluck those out so that you don't lose the planting. The species is green with a little bit of white on the leaf, pinkish flowers on it. Is very good scrambling in among hostas and other plants to cover the ground. Almost evergreen. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong way with my clicker. There's that white spot in the leaf. And it's a good ground cover to have in places where you can, like I say, let it mix it up. It's mixing it up here with chrysogonum, green and gold. European ginger is an evergreen, round, glossy leaf that in the right circumstances, and shade is really the best place for it. Like ours is quite happy underneath pines. That's where we first started growing it for clients. It is very short, but it's quite reliably evergreen, which means that it's going to keep seeds from hitting the ground and things from starting in it. As we said earlier in maintenance, you still have to weed a ground cover. Once a year is our big deal on ground cover areas. It will seed itself. It'll come up where you don't expect it to come up, and you can let it grow or not grow. One pot in 1 year can easily triple in size as it gets going. Foam flower is a native relative of the coral bells. The one that makes a good ground cover is not what you're likely to find at the nurseries. It is the native one, or a variety of the native, not a hybrid. It has runners, a little bit like strawberry, and the runners go out and start new plants, and that makes it a ground cover. Many of the hybrids are hybrids between coral bell, which is a clump forming plant, and foam flower, and those hybrids stay in a clump. They don't make as good a ground cover when they're just sitting there in a clump. But it's very jolly, has a long bloom period early in the springtime, usually for a month. There's flowers on it. Very good in deep shade. This one, although you see light on it here, Steve takes the pictures when there's enough light to show it. It's very good in the shade. In fact, in the sun, tends to burn out a little bit. Some of the varieties have denser flower clusters. That's what you're looking at there, versus the species, which is more open. Some of the varieties and the hybrids have these colorful leaves and fancy leaves of one kind or another. You're probably going to need to avoid those if you want a ground cover, because there as a ground cover, just look at it. It just spreads itself out. That's our rocky runway, grabbing the downspout and pulling the water away. And back here gets very little of any kind of open sun or water, and still does just as well. And it also is evergreen, which is helpful. We talked about hens and chickens earlier, hens and chicks, cute little guys. Lily turf, also called liriope, or down south, liriope or monkey grass. Quite a few different kinds of it. This is one of the variegated golden green liriopes. It's evergreen in a good winter, but it shouldn't be treated as an evergreen. It really needs to be mowed off in the northern areas where we are, because the foliage burns back and can look quite unsightly in the spring. But once it takes hold, once the clump fills out, it does densely cover the ground, and then it advances its clump and increases the clump, kind of like a daylily does. It's a little hard to get rid of once you decide to have it in, because it has so many runners and tubers in the ground. So it's like daylilies. Once you get daylilies in, you're going to have daylilies in that area until you really work hard at it. But it is a grassy looking plant, thinner leaved, broader leaved, full green version here. It will bloom. I planted our first liriope because it's an August bloomer, and I was looking for things to give us color in August. But these flowers are quite hidden down in the leaves. You don't often see them, little purple, kind of lavender looking flowers. Here's an older clump, ground cover that's laying over a bit because it's so full in the area. Here's one of the dwarf liriopes that spread itself between the stones. The nice thing is that it does not grow by runners, so it's not going to come out and cover the stones the way that some things can. Liriope, lily turf, or monkey grass. I'm partial to the variegated ones. This is a golden satin grass next to a variegated liriope. They're a little slower to spread than the all green ones, and I like them for the winter interest that they provide next to things like hellebores with their big leaves. So we have hellebores back behind the boxwood, hellebores with big leaves, then boxwood, then variegated liriope in the front, and it's a good winter combination. Here's what you get to see in the springtime, though, is a lot of foliage that's burned off that then needs to be with a weed whip usually, or look the other way for a while and let it grow back over itself, because the new growth will eventually cover over the dead stuff. Pachysandra we talked about already. Good ground cover, but not one that plays nicely with others. I do not like maybe one clump of hostas someplace in it, and every year you have to cut the Pachysandra back around it, slice down into the ground, take out all the Pachysandra runners that are heading into your hosta. But to have a lot of hostas in it and a lot of other plants is a lot of cutting loose all through the year. So I didn't mind in one client's yard cutting around the Aurelia every year to make sure that there was not too much competition for the Aurelia. But I was glad to have the separation of a hard border here between it and anything else. Pachysandra and Stephanandra, which won by virtue of its height. Pretty and evergreen. Creeping phlox and woodland phlox. Creeping phlox, the one that you most often see is Phlox subulata. There are two kinds, divaricata and stolonifera are two of the shady species of phloxes. This is the phlox that in the springtime, non-gardeners will stop and knock on your door and say, excuse me, what is that plant? Because it's blooming already in April. And they see this just a carpet of color. They, of course, think that it's going to bloom like that all year. It's really only got about a 2-3 week period, but it is glorious then. And there are pinks, there are deep violet colors, there's a red violet, there's white. It is a native North American native, not native to the Great Lakes, but North American native that a lot has been done for by the rock gardeners in getting different varieties with different colors. The phlox species that are good ground covers in the shade are things like Phlox stolonifera. That's this one running around in here and sending its flowers up. They stand high above the non-evergreen foliage. It is one that I'd like to use more in woodland areas, but it is one that the rabbits and the groundhogs like to eat, and I haven't been able to establish very many big beds like this with it, but where we can, we're very happy with it. Creeping phlox, the Phlox subulata that I said the rock garden societies have done so much with, is here, and we took out lawn and we took clumps from here, divisions from here, and set them out. The next spring, they're almost touching already. This is all going to be myrtle over here, but it's a good ground cover. Every once in a while, they die back. The center will die out. Generally, it'll be August when it gets stressed by heat, and it's sometimes, maybe often, it's a nematode infestation that gets in the ground. And when you get that, I will generally say, let's take the phlox out, give the space a rest, grow something else in it for a few years, grow a different ground cover. Behind it is a ground cover of comfrey. Two of them fight it out there. This is after the bloom and it's mowed back. This is the melting out that you'll see in heat, and it'll come back and it'll seem like it's fine in the springtime, and you'll let it go and it gets a little worse year by year. Oops, sorry, went the wrong way. If you don't clip, if you don't clip, I roll my finger on the mouse and it just takes off. If you don't clip it back, don't mow it or weed whip it, you'll see seed heads forming on it, but otherwise it's fine. We don't do anything to it. We talked about rock cress. This is the false rock cress. We talked about rock cress earlier today. There's the true rock cress, Erebus. I like it. Mustard family plant, quick to spread itself around. Evergreen, so it covers the ground really nicely. It needs to be in the sun. We'll do a bit in the part shade, but won't move into that shade underneath the pine. Not going to do that. Rug junipers we talked about earlier, so we'll just look at them again. One of my favorites. I love rug junipers. Rug juniper. Rug juniper just laying over the edge. That's one rug juniper. Somebody asked one of my kids how big they get, and they said infinity, and it's true. As they can keep rooting and moving along, they do. This is Cerastium tomentosum, the snow and summer. We talked about this earlier. So we won't do snow and summer again. Great evergreen. They're coming down the hill out of the shade into more sun. Good plant to cross the line. We mentioned thyme, but didn't show you thyme. This is mother of thyme. It's an evergreen subshrub, lays flat on the ground, does a very good job of covering stones. There are stones underneath there. Will grow in its own leaf litter. You can just pick it up and find it. It's just growing roots right onto the sidewalk there. This is all thyme. It's thyme, mother of thyme, creeping thyme, red thyme, all different kinds of thyme. It's a thyme lawn. Not so good to walk on. You walk on thyme too much and it really wears it out. But they bloom, the various times bloom at different times. And there are green and gray foliage, and there's white, pink, and reddish colored flowers. Not shade tolerant at all. Thyme is not something that's going to grow into the shade. Even the shade from being near the bloodgrass next to there is going to be a problem. Creeping woolly thyme is one of my favorites as a ground cover. It's very low, which makes it a neater plant for us. We don't have to do a lot of cutting back. It's low, it's very dense, it's very springy, so it keeps seeds from reaching the ground. It's pretty when it blooms. Here it's covering the wall, the retaining wall like Sonia's place, because they didn't like looking at that long wall. This is a great cover for it. Here is one of the taller cooking thymes growing as a ground cover along the walkway here. Red thyme. And thyme in the foreground here. Sometimes when Steve gives me a bunch of pictures, I put them all in and don't edit them afterwards. Thyme. This is woolly thyme. It's very good for people who have dwarf conifers, like my client here who has dwarf conifers. They're trying to keep things down very low so it doesn't compete with the conifers, and that's what it does. Dennis clears it away regularly, keeps it from rooting in there. Probably wouldn't root very well underneath those plants anyway. Whoops, wrong way. Woolly thyme and the other thymes have a tendency to who knows what it is, that some winters it happens, they die back. See the piece that's gone here? It died back. And they said, well, what happened? I said, they just do that sometimes in the winter. Clip it back, just clip off all the dead stuff and let it grow back out. It'll do that very quickly. This is one of the white creeping thymes growing with the conifers in the front yard in that other garden. White creeping thyme. Oops, I thought I had a piece of it growing back. Well, it does grow back very quickly when it dies back. The native Pachysandra we mentioned earlier today, it is semi-evergreen as opposed to being fully evergreen like the Japanese Pachysandra that we showed you earlier. It is slower to spread, quite pretty in the fall. Nice thing to have. We talked about bear and strawberry. This is one of our favorite ones. It's everything on the list we do use, but border jewel. Border jewel is this plant. It's a persicaria. It used to be called a polygonum, and it got reassigned to persicaria. These are not seed flowers on here. Those are seed heads. It was white flowers earlier, whitish pink flowers. Does a really good job of holding its own. There's a clump getting started in the test gardens at Chicago Botanic Gardens trial area. So there you see the flowers when it's blooming. Has a long bloom period and is making seed while it's blooming. So you get quite a color show as the season goes on. In the winter, it turns kind of chocolatey brown, maybe not chocolatey, red brown color. But it continues, it is deciduous, but it's still covering the ground, and then it'll green back up for the summertime. I'm not sure why this one, I put that one in there. Border jewel is technically a variety name, but it got assigned kind of like Band-Aid to the whole bunch of them. It's easier to say than Himalayan fleece flower. It does have some bigger relatives that we tell people, well, yeah, they're nice to have, but I would rather have a low ground cover. We'd rather have no maintenance where we don't have to cut things back, just let the foliage die down to the ground and let the new foliage cover. The bigger persicarias, many of them good in rain gardens, tend to bloom quite a bit taller. And that means that you have more stuff to take care of and more stuff to get rid of. There's one of the border jewels, taller relatives in the background. Creeping forget-me-not is Myosotis scorpioides. It's probably not native, although it seems like it's native. As best anybody can tell, it came across with the Vikings. So about 1,000 years ago, this found its way here. It's a true perennial creep forget-me-not. It is not the forget-me-not that goes to seed and then all the plants turn black and they come back from seed the next year. This one creeps along the ground and blooms off and on through the summer. So this is the biennial forget-me-not that a lot of people know. Very bright blue color, and that's pretty when it blooms, and then it's nasty looking afterwards. But it is pretty. It's not as bright a blue. This is the creeping forget-me-not, and loves to be along the edge of the water. Our first piece of it we found on a canoe trip, and I said, "What the heck is this? I don't even know what it is." So we called it canoe blue for years. But it is creeping forget-me-not, and this is just a solid mat of it at a client's place along the creek behind their house. This is in a garden where we put it. You can see the wet. It's by a rain garden area. And what it does is it blooms heavily in the spring and then off and on all summer long, because it keeps extending itself through whatever area you give it. It does bloom off and on. It is a plant that likes moisture, but we do pretty well with it in a regular garden as a good companion to other ground covers to mix it up. We talked about golden coins earlier. One of the things we mix up the creeping forget-me-not with. Golden coins, you can see the gold in there. Golden star is a native chrysogonum. Both Cheryl Bennerup and we feel very fondly about Chrysogonum virginianum. It's here at a client's garden. This is a very shady garden. Doesn't look like it here, but it only gets about 2 hours of sun in the middle of the day. We're underneath a great big silver maple where we're standing right now. And the sun manages to go from the maple over to pines and shade this area for most of the day. And we planted the chrysogonum, the green and gold, or golden star, right there. Here it is, spread and blooming. It's a cheerful little plant. Off and on it'll bloom. We put some into it's one of the plants that we'll be using in our garden here now. We bought one plant at a nursery last year and let it grow for the year to make sure that it seemed to like the place where we were putting it underneath a fir. It bulked up very well. So at the end of the year, we divided the one plant into about 20 pieces and spread it out. And I expect it to do just what you see here. Covers the ground well and gives a cheery color in a shady area. Lamb's ear. People don't think lamb's ear is a ground cover. They just cuss at it for spreading. Let it spread. Probably the most impressive thing that we saw, we can't seem to find our pictures of, but was a rock garden. Well, not a rock garden in the horticultural sense, but an area filled with cobblestones. and allowed lamb's ear to just seed itself around in there. You could almost not tell that there was lamb's ear in there because they looked like all stones all over the ground, gray fuzzy leaves. The best ground cover lamb's ears are the non-blooming types. This one is called big ears. Here and there it'll get a bloom stalk on it, but you don't really want that in a ground cover because the bloom stalk will be 12 inches, maybe taller than that. And to neaten it up, you're going to have to cut them all down. So this one is called silver carpet, another of the non-blooming lamb's ears. Makes a good combination with other ground covers like euonymus. Lily of the Valley is not one of our favorites, but it is, we do agree, it is a plant that does well in a place where you put it. This is the variegated form, much slower than the all green type. But both the variegated form and the all green type do something that we don't like in a ground cover, which is if it spreads itself out of the shade where you put it, where it does quite well, and spreads into the sun, come summertime, it's going to get a leaf spot, it's going to look nasty, and we don't like that. So we would prefer to use the variegated one in little clumps that don't spread very much. But if you've got a tough place, Lily of the Valley will definitely cover it for you. Here at the end of Audrey's bed, I took out the catmint because years ago we thought we took out the Lily of the Valley, but some of it stayed in the rock, the concrete wall that's built there. And after taking the catmint down, it's fairly easy to get the catmint down. It grows in clumps and covers the ground well. Then I had to take apart the rock wall to get all of the Lily of the Valley runners that are in there. We joked, Audrey and I, let's just give the area back to the Lily of the Valley. By next year, we'll fill it right in. But there's enough sun there that it was looking pretty nasty in August. Purple leaf violet is Viola labradorica. We first grew this violet. No, this is not it. We first grew Viola labradorica because we have black Labrador retrievers, and we thought, oh, we should have labradorica. There are a lot of native violets. This is the yellow downy violet, I think, and you can see what kind of a ground cover it is. It's everywhere here. It's all the yellow violet, but other things do grow in it. It's just that it will grow way into the dense shade, into places where other things don't grow. The purple one, Viola labradorica, we grew it years and years ago as a plant in our garden for the labs. And then we found that it really did spread, and we didn't want it as a ground cover. So we let it lapse. We didn't bring it with us to the new house, but I looked around and I found it here. I said, oh, look, that's Viola labradorica with the purple leaves. Those purpley leaves rather than the green leaves of the common violet. So I put a piece of it in these rocks are underneath our crabapple, and this area is a ground cover area. Here's border jewel, fleece flower. Back behind it, we can't quite see it very well, is the Stilbe chinensis. And I said, well, then along with the ginger here's European ginger and our native ginger. We'll put some Viola labradorica in there. And that's 1 year after I put it in there. I put one piece in and it's creeping between the rocks, doing what we want it to do, which is cover the ground. It's pretty when it blooms. It gets greener later, but it's already hopped across by seed. It hopped across the sidewalk and is growing where I didn't want to have things growing in this space underneath our window, but we'll probably let it grow in there too. Violets you're going to need to weed more than other ground covers, but they're very cheerful little things that when they get into people's lawns, we wonder why they get so upset. Pussy's Toes is a very short ground cover. You're looking at the tallest it gets when it blooms here. The foliage lays flat on the ground and makes a carpet. It is one of the only larval foods of the American lady butterfly. Their caterpillars eat this plant, and so we wanted to have it, and it is native in our neighborhood. So we're using it as a ground cover, one of the ground covers that we're going to use right out by the street. This is a planting that is 1 year old, of some pieces that we brought from a commons area in our neighborhood where I found it growing in the grass being mowed. So I took out the pieces and brought them here. In the spring, these are last year's leaves, which do a great job in the wintertime of covering the ground. And they are themselves covered by very deep snow. This is where I stack up most of our snow to make snow creatures here. New foliage coming and getting ready to bloom. Very easy to split up. So here for Sonia's house, where we were putting in for butterflies, we buy one plant and slice it into 4 pieces, no problem. Spreads very quickly. So this one that I started The year after I started it, I expanded the bed and I put pieces of it out here in April. And in October, there's those pieces growing and I'm expanding the bed further. I'm trying to get rid of this area out here. People talk about their health strips or out lawns that they plant. If we had a sidewalk in our neighborhood, this would be the out lawn. And this is not grass, it's green, but it's actually just a whole combination of spotted spurge and crabgrass and plantain. So I want that out so we don't have a seed bank of things that can get into the woolly thyme and the pussy's toes, which are very low, very neat ground covers. The gray will someday meet the green and cover that area for us. We do also in that have another plant that the American lady caterpillar lives on called Pearly Everlasting. It's much too tall. It's a good ground cover. It fills in very thickly, keeps other things out, but it's too tall. In the wintertime, that's all going to lay down and either need to be clipped back or ignored for weeks in the spring as new growth comes up. But for the sake of the butterflies, we put it out there. We'll probably let that go eventually. The spreading species of sedums are wonderful sunny ground covers. This is sedum spurium, or I think they call it the dragon's blood sedum because it has a reddish stem on it. That has some varieties like red carpet, which have redder leaves in the springtime. And that's a sedum spurium also, flowing in between the rocks. They're almost evergreen. That's a sedum, oh, I've forgotten the name of this one. Staphyphilum. There are so many of them, it gets to be a little on the crazy side. You can collect and mix them all up together. This one is sedum acre or acre. Very quick to spread. One of my clients asked us one time, you know, how can I get more of this? I said, just pick it up and throw it down the hill where you want it to be. Just it will root itself. This is sedum kamchatkam or Kamchatka sedum. It blooms yellow. It's another one of our favorite ones because this is a rebloom. You can see the seed heads from the first bloom in June, and it is blooming again. It has a variegated form. It has a bronzy leafed form, and it turns a nice orange in the fall. This is sedum kamchatkam blooming here. This is a whole collection of short ground cover sedums. At Adrian retired from the University of Michigan Botanical Garden, and we were talking to her this day. Just probably about every sedum she could get a hold of, thrown out in her outlawn. They do quite well there. She is toward the end of the street. They do use salt on the street, but she says it's not a real heavy salt. In terms of ground cover, I don't really myself like the blue-leaved sedums as much as the green and bronzy leaf sedums. The blue leaf sedums tend to turn a color that I don't like, but you'll find them used a lot and able to mix it up with a lot of other plants. This is one of the red carpet sedums. This one is one of the Kamchatkam sedums. They're good ground covers. Sweet woodruff in the shade. People say, oh, what a weed. It spreads. Well, that's what ground covers do. This is sweet woodruff. It's the flower that you put into May wine. You take some of the flowers when it blooms in May and put them in a bottle of white wine, let them sit for a few days, and then take the sprig out and drink the wine as a spring tonic. I like it. We use it quite a bit in gardens because although, yes, it does spread, it's an underground spreader. They're fairly easy to cut and pull back, and they don't get tall, so I can grow them with taller plants like hellebores and hostas and let them come right up to the feet of the hellebore or the hosta and not have to try to spread them away. They offer to the bigger leaved, taller plants a contrast in texture, finer texture, coarser texture. They also have a nice smell when you dry any of the leaves, or in the fall, as the plant goes down for the winter, it has the smell of new mown hay from that coumarin, kind of a vanilla smell. Let's see, underneath things like Rogersia, hellebores, hostas, ligularias here, it makes a nice contrast underneath Solomon seal and Brunnera. Underneath peonies here, this is in the part shade. We don't put it in the full sun, part shade and shade. In the full sun, it tends to bronze out, which we don't like, but is not bothering the peonies, which tend to not like competition from other plants. It's not a heavy competitor. So we just cage up the peonies. Those are willow twigs, and just let them grow up. The wild ginger, or Asarum canadense, is our native ginger. It's not evergreen. It's got a bigger leaf. Does an excellent fast job of covering the ground in shaded areas. It will go figure on plants. It'll seed itself out into the sun. I keep finding gingers out in a sunny area near where we have them as a ground cover in the shade. And I always ask them, what do you think you're doing out here? Because you're just going to burn in the sun, but they're very willing. It is not a ginger you can eat, but if you do take a piece of the root, it's a creeping rhizome. It grows just below the surface. If you do take a piece of the root and snap it, you'll smell the ginger smell. And I understand that you can use it as a spice, but it's not the ginger that we use in, say, in Oriental cooking. It is a beautiful leaf, just a gorgeous leaf and a good spreader. It's holding its own with the myrtle, but I'm not sure that it's going to last for very long there. Archangel, somebody who will be listening to this, one of my clients would right now be rearing back going, you can't tell people to plant that. In fact, this is her yard. Archangel looks a bit like Lamium, except it blooms yellow. And it's not evergreen. It has a white splashed leaf on it, but it really does a good job of covering the ground. It was taken out from this area. We're trying to keep it back here. And I do that in my garden right now. I do that as I have had for years for many clients. It's in the neighbor's yard. I don't really want it to come across. And so once a year, I go along the edge and I cut down with a spade and get any spreaders that were going underground and any vines that were coming across the top of the ground, and I clip them back. And that's pretty much keeps it under control. But you have to draw that line in the first place. You can't let it get up to the blue arrow and then try to keep it under control. Ginger, wild ginger here, and Brunnera with it. Vinca minor is another one that I don't plant, but I respect. It does a very good job of a dense cover. Doesn't compete with grass, and people always, their biggest concern with it is the grass gets into it. Yeah, grass is a top dog plant, and if grass gets into it, you're going to need to lift up the vinca and take the grass out from underneath. And more importantly, stop growing the vinca where the myrtle, where it's in enough sun that grass can get going. Because if grass has enough sun, it can get going into the myrtle. If the myrtle's in the shade, you generally don't see it getting invaded by grass. So it'll grow even underneath the oak leaf hydrangea. And it occurs to me we already talked about myrtle earlier in the earlier chapter, so we'll go past. And we talked about pig's-squeak already, which very unfairly has just one picture here. It's a very pretty plant, especially in the winter when it turns purple. Why did I skip past something here? There we go. The sedges, carex, a lot of different species of carex. Some people think they're grasses. Sedges have edges. They have a folded leaf and it's a sharp edge on them. And there are a number of sedges, some for moist areas, some for shaded areas. This particular one, Carex muskingamensis, it does well even out into the sun and is a good almost evergreen ground cover that takes foot traffic. The sedges have these seed flowering structures and seed pods that are not particularly attractive, but are interesting. We put that sedge, we have a wattle fence along the corner here and had pennisedums, a grassy plant, but we couldn't seem to keep people from walking across that corner anyway. So we gave up trying to keep them from walking across the corner. They just beat the corner up terribly. And we said, well, we'll just put the muskingamensis, the Carex muskingamensis there and let it fill. And it took the beating. The pennisedum we then moved out and did very well there. So try some Carexes. They're all clump forming. They're well, muskingamensis is a little faster clump, but they don't spread too crazily in the garden. Fescues, the blue fescue, Festuca glauca, Festuna ovina glauca, is a clump former. It's not going to spread by itself. If it does, if it sets seed and spreads by itself, generally it won't be as blue as the variety you started with. But if you've got a dry, sunny area, it's a good, short, grassy ground cover. This is the tallest it gets when it's in bloom. and you can cut the flower stalks off or not as you want to do. It's a true evergreen. It's going to be green. It's going to be still blue or more green in the springtime. We just comb it out. So we'll go through and we'll rake over the top of it and take out the old foliage. We talked about the pulmonarias earlier today. We call them Bethlehem sage. Some people call them lungwort pulmonarias because they look like a diseased lung. So said the medieval medics. Big leaf aster we talked about earlier today, just briefly. It is a native in a lot of the Northeast United States and the Eastern United States. It grows in the woods in the dense shade right up to tree trunks. The big leaf is there in the springtime and the summer, covering the ground. Can be quite attractive when it gets going. We don't have very many big areas of it because it's hard to get this native plant. It's hard to find it, to buy it. Once you get it, it spreads pretty readily. It blooms though, and this is our big draw to it. It blooms in the late summer, September, even October, with white flowers or more often the blue-purple flowers. The flowers stand up 12, 15 inches. The foliage stays down low on the ground. Good dry shade plant. This is the kind of place where you would find it. Here it is. It's in bloom. It's in fall. But there it is. It's occupying spaces where nothing else wants to grow. So you could tell me, but I can't remember whether this is in the Appalachians or whether this is along that walk between Winchester and in Massachusetts. I can't remember what woods we're walking in. It would appear that it's time for me to feed the dogs, so I need to hurry up and get this chapter done. Like that, it's growing right in the rubble. Okay, my favorite for dry shade is Brunnera, which we call big leaf forget-me-not. Brunnera macrophylla, the big leaf Brunnera. Big leaves, blue flowers at forget-me-not time in the springtime. Spreads by seed, not by runners. So we lay the seed pods on because it seeds itself around and fills out the area. It does not get too tall. It doesn't require a lot of water. Here's the foliage of a young plant that spreads from behind. There are varieties that have variegated leaves. As a ground cover, just use the green one. Here it is, that's ginger. It's behind and spreading into the ginger area. There we go. So here it is, approximating a hosta. Hosta's in the background. Big leaf forget-me-not here. Big leaf forget-me-not spreading itself around in the shade along the walkway. One of the variegated, maybe looking glass, maybe Jack Frost. I've kind of got them all mixed up in my mind. Variegata, I know what that one is. It's a good workhorse plant. I was glad that it was in this garden here where we are now. Well, there were a few of them. I've taken them and divided them up and let them spread, and they're going to be our major ground cover underneath our spruces. Doing a good job so far. The variegated ones do tend to scorch if they put themselves out into the sun, and they do revert to all green. Bishop's weed or goutweed we talked about earlier. We won't talk about it again. If you've got it, you may want to change your perspective. Most people are trying to get rid of it. You might want to look and say, maybe I need to leave that plant there and just let it hold that area for me because it's a good ground cover. And try to keep it under control so it doesn't spread any further. The green leaf form spreads a lot faster than the variegated one. Canada anemone, another of our natives. Some people say, oh, don't plant it. It spreads too terribly. You plant a ground cover, you want it to spread. It spreads by very, very thin underground runners, which makes it difficult to get rid of because you need to get rid of all of the thin pieces coming from it. So put it where you want it to grow. Springtime, very bright white flowers. Foliage looks a little bit like a trolleus or a geranium. Here it is at one of our friends' gardens as a ground cover out here. Here it is. We mixed it with, at the Detroit Zoo, we mixed it with Solomon seal and let the two of them duke it out. Can have a very long bloom season. Here it is, overwhelming some Telema and sweet woodruff. It's a good ground cover. I must have missed a black. There we go. The dwarfostilbe we talked about earlier. Dwarfostilbe. Good dense foliage, short bloom, short stalk that blooms in late August. New planting. Tough area underneath the deck where we're letting it spread as a ground cover, and it's spreading back into the gravel and under the deck. Just cleaning the leaves out once a year. Golden bleeding heart, one of my favorites of all for shade. It spreads by seed, so you need to have it in the garden for a little bit before the seedlings start coming, and then they come where you have older plants and younger plants in the same planting, and the younger plants bloom later than the older plants, so you have this bloom period that goes right through the summer. Gold sparkles in the shade. Pairs very well with big leaves like hostas, or in this case, opuntias. I think this is at your garden, Cheryl Benrop's garden. No. It's a cheerful plant, a very cheerful plant. Hard to find at nurseries because it doesn't look good in a pot. What you need to do is find somebody who has one, has some of them. Take one plant, put it in your garden, keep cleared around it. It's going to take the second year probably before you start seeing seedlings come up, and you need to keep clear around it. It's not going to do a very quick job of spreading if you put it in among myrtle or other plants like this. You need to give it a place where it can spread by seed. Golden satin grass bulks up kind of slowly, but is a shih tzu, a little bitty dog, weeping-haired dog growing along on the ground, crawling along on the ground. The golden form is very popular, but the all green is beautiful. There's one with a bit of a pink stripe in it. It's got a very graceful ground cover and a finer texture to go with your bigger leaves like the hibiscus. Belongs in the shade and part shade. If you put it in the sun, it does tend to really look a little bit disturbing in the hot part of the summer. So you have to give it some time to spread. I say, put it in and let it be. Keep the weeds out from around it. Won't fight very well with evergreens because it's not there in the summertime. It's not there in the wintertime, sorry. Here it is duking it out with some pachysandra, some liriopes, some perennial geraniums, some vinca. Everybody gets in with it. And that's the winter look then. You can cut it back if you want to cut it back. It's going to cover itself back up. And in ground cover areas, I like to do as little cutting back as possible. Some of the hostas spread. Hosta nakina and Hosta sieboldii, not sieboldina, are hostas that form bigger and bigger clumps with smaller leaves that make good ground covers. Some of them are actually, Hosta ginkgo Craig is one of the hybrids of nakina. Well, I think it's a hybrid of nakina that actually spreads by little rhizomes underground. So they're kind of miniature hostas that spread themselves around. Whoops. Do a good job of spreading. I think this is at Versal Fraley's garden. Versal retired from a nursery, from his nursery, and sold the property. And I do hope that a gardener bought his property. Lady's mantle, we discussed earlier. Big, beautiful leaves that hold water nicely. It spreads by seed. Each clump gets bigger by dropping those seeds. Those are all lady's mantle seeds. Alliums growing through it. Large flowered comfrey, kind of a workhorse ground cover. Sun, shade, doesn't matter. This is not the comfrey that you may have grown if you're an herb gardener. It's not the 6 foot tall Russian comfrey. This is a low plant, think hosta sized, big leaves. The flowers are dangly things in May, early June. They're pretty, but they're not there for very long, and you're not growing it for the flowers. You're growing it because these few plants that we put out here become very quickly those plants, covering the ground for you. Grows in the dry, grows in the wet. Here it is, filling in that same area in the second year. So this is that area. You have to look and see the rocks. It's covered the rocks over. Anyway, same plant. It's a good thing that keeps the weeds out, and the deer don't eat it. It's not a particularly wonderful looker. It's a texture that you're using when you're using large flowered comfrey. There it is in bloom. in a different shady area. And let me see, where the heck did I put this? Oh, at Jill's garden. Here it is in a part sun area, filling in underneath the burning bushes and competing as a ground cover with the creeping phlox. Maidenhair fern, we talked about this earlier. Maidenhair, like the head is right here and the hair is streaming down the back and shoulders. Great plant where it wants to grow. I have not yet figured out exactly what the perfect place is, but shade and moisture seem to be a big thing. Mayapple, our native mayapple. Here they are. Look like umbrellas opening up in the springtime. We planted just a few of them. Where'd they go? Mayapple. I can see all the jack in the pulpits here, but I know the mayapples are in. Oh, there they are in the background. So there, we planted just a few in there. I think we planted 9 in this area from here and going back through this part of the garden. And by the next year, we were already able to take some of the runners from underground and move them. The flower is not spectacular. You have to be down on the ground to see the flower, but it's pretty, it's big. And they are a good ground cover. Same area after we've spread it out a little bit. It can get a leaf spot in the summertime, particularly if it's very dry or if it's too sunny. And in that case where you see the leaf spot, you're best to mow it down, get the leaves out of there. Painted fern, one of the ferns that does well in dry. So Ethereum geringianum, also called Ethereum japonicum, pictum, with the, sometimes the leaves are more purpley color, sometimes more white, but this is a fern that grows where it's drier. And that's a very good thing to have when you're looking for the ferny texture and to cover the ground. So those ferns, come on, show us afterwards. Oh, well. In with the comfrey here in that part shady area. That's right, with the comfrey right here. Perennial geraniums, way up high on our list of ground covers. Geranium macrorhizum, big root. That's what that literally means. Big root geranium, geranium maculatum, which is the spotted native geranium, and geranium sanguineum, also called the blood red cranesbill, are great ground covers. This is geranium macrorhizum, big root perennial geranium. It has a fragrant leaf. It's almost evergreen, turns a fall color, spreads nicely, but doesn't get carried away with itself. It just, the clump gets bigger every year. So it's easy to keep under control. So we can keep it here, flanking the walkway and complementing the yews and the Japanese maple. Here where we're letting it mix it up with various ferns, there's some Christmas fern in here and some others related to Christmas ferns. And that's geranium macrorhizum and the big root geranium. This is one of the hybrids of big root geranium or varieties of big root geranium. There is both a pink flowered form and a white flowered form. Whoops, sorry, going the wrong way. This is another of the hybrids. Might be called Claridge Druce, don't remember anymore, with a deeper pink flower. Fall color. The deer do not eat it, so I use it in herb garden, in woodland gardens. Nancy, you were asking this morning about Lindera angustifolia and whether they're scraggly. Here are Lindera angustifolias. This is in the springtime. These are last year's leaves hanging on, getting ready for new leaves to grow. This is the next year. Sorry. This is planted. This is the next year filling in, and they met the year after. We're looking at, we rotated 90 degrees to look at it. We were looking at it from over here. Now we're looking at it from here, but they've met and fill in the area. They do not let other plants grow in with them. Very good, tough plant. Geranium maculatum, our native one, spotted geranium. When it comes up in the spring, the leaves have a distinctive spotted look to them. Blooms with lilac colored flowers and spit seeds around. That's pretty much how it spreads. It is not as dense as big root geranium, but it's pretty and it's native. Mixes it up well with columbines and other native plants. Geranium sanguineum is the one that set itself into the golden satin grass here. It is not evergreen, but it is a tough competitor, a very tough competitor. Once it gets into some place, it's difficult to get rid of it. The flowers are red violet rather than being, as you see here. Very good ground cover, one of the ones that existed by itself even during the 15 years that we were in our last garden, our last 15 years there, we were mostly battling floods and not gardening as much as we were. And the plants that made it without care were the ones that made it high up on our list, and geranium sanguineum is one of them. This is geranium Johnson's Blue, or one of the Johnson's Blue varieties, which is also a good ground cover, but much more lax, much more of a floppy thing. We don't use it so much for ground cover as for pretty looks. This is one of the big root geraniums hybrids with another of the smaller geraniums, so it's a denser, smaller plant. It's a good ground cover, good ground cover. Okay, plumbago. Cheryl mentioned this, and this is one of our all-time favorites. Ceratostigma plumbaganoides. It looks like plumbago, but it's a ceratostigma leadwort for blue flowers. Blue flowers in August. That's what first got me to grow it. This is a planting that I showed you earlier, where we just set out 6 or 7 plants, come into its 3rd year, where this is all plumbago, getting ready to bloom blue. And then while it's still blooming blue, it tends to have the seed pods you see are kind of a rusty ochre color, and the leaves are going into fall color. It's got some pretty look to it. And they're in the deep fall. The butterflies like it in the summertime when it's blooming. But the biggest, this is soon me taking apart her other perennial garden over here. The biggest draw for plumbago for us as a ground cover is that in the spring, it takes a long time to get started. It's not evergreen, it's deciduous, it dies back. So in the springtime, there it is with a bit of lamium. In the springtime, this area is clear. There's nothing there but the bare stems where the leaves have fallen off, and they're just kind of sprawled on the ground in there. And that means that that whole area can be spring bulbs, and they don't mind at all being grown on top of by the plumbago later. So we put spring bulbs in here. There's that planting you just saw a few minutes ago in the year that we planted it. And then when it's filled in. Now it does travel underground. So you do have to say that's as far as I want you to go, and either put a barrier there or cut it back regularly. We don't find it to be too onerous a job to do that. Heinous a job. There it is in fall color underneath the Japanese maple. We mix it up there with some lamium, fall color, in bloom, and with fall bulbs under it. This is why we use it at our current house. This is at Niagara Falls Botanical Garden. And these are colchicum or fall crocus. They're not actually a crocus, they're colchicum. And they have great big strapping leaves that come up in the spring and then die back. So the entire area is covered with these great big leaves in the springtime. Then those leaves go back, the plumbago comes up, and then the colchicum blooms. It's a good cover for the whole area throughout the year. There's a double form of the colchicum. I personally like the single form better with the plumbago. Serbian bellflower, it's a creeping bellflower. So they say it can get 18 inches high. Well, that's the 18 inches if it can get something to lean against. It creeps, it lays out, grows between the cracks in the sidewalk and up walls, or in the case of our client here, is growing. We planted it here and it's working its way down the wall. You can see it poking out here and here, where it's threading itself in the wall. And that's what we'd like it to do. We don't want weeds in those cracks. We'd like to have Serbian bellflower in there, in bloom. Solomon seal, the polygonatum species, there are quite a few of them. This is the native polygonatum biflorum or two-flowered Solomon seal, growing and covering the ground very well here. When they come up in the spring, one of our clients calls them penis plants, because they come up as pink points coming up in the springtime and can be quite attractive as they come up, I think. Then the flowers hang all along the stems. They hang in twos on biflorum. This is polygonatum comitatum, our giant Solomon seal. It can be 5 feet tall easily. It's still a ground cover because it grows like an iris. These are rhizomes that are connected below the ground, and it just keeps spreading itself out. very willingly. This is the Asian version of our native biflorum. This is odoratum, polygonatum odoratum, and it's the variegated form of polygonatum odoratum. So you've got a white edge, goldish, creamy edge on the leaf. Very pretty plant. Pretty in the fall too. So this is the Asian sweet. There's again the Asian sweet biflorum. This is a very dry garden underneath ashes and mulberries. Very shady, very dry, and the Solomon seal does very well. Starry false Solomon seals. There are a number of false Solomon seals. Smilacina stellata is one of our best for shade. This is a very shady garden, happens to be a moist shady garden, but this is a great one for dry shade as well. It doesn't appear to care which way it goes. The flowers on the false Solomon seals, the leaves can be very similar in their arrangement and the arching stems to the other Solomon seal, but the flowers are held at the tips of the leaf, of the stalk, not all along the leaves. And this is a starry false Solomon seal. This one single stem that you see here and there, if you give it some space, there they are, just a single stem. If you give it some space, it does this. This is a very pretty plant to have in the garden. Virginia bluebells, Mertensia virginica, is a ephemeral. They come up in the spring, great big leaves that come up kind of blue-purple and change to green, bloom blue from pink buds, and then they die back, seed themselves around very readily. There's a great park in one of the metro parks in around Dayton. There's acres of it. It's so pretty in the springtime. What is the name of that garden? Okay, one of these, the southwest side of Dayton. Go look at the metro park there. It used to be an individual's home and is now a park. Pink and blue together. Acres without really any problem. What you need is something to cover it later in the year, like ferns, a ground cover plumbago, something that comes up later. These are seedlings that a client brought some seed stalks home. They were dying back. He said, what do I do with these? I said, let them just lay there and finish ripening the seed and then spread the seed in the garden. And I explained, I said, spread some sand and then spread the seed on top of the sand down there so that you get a bit of a natural mulch there. And here are all the seedlings coming up, the lighter green leaf, all the seedlings coming up the next year already. Very willing to do that for you and then spread in your garden. Very pretty plant to have. I grow it with Japanese painted fern in a lot of gardens, and the fern comes up after it. Good combination. This is wood poppy, another of our natives, Stylophorum. Very bright yellow in the shade. It is a clump forming plant that spreads by seed. So it goes into and fills spaces that you leave it in a wooded area. So we're starting it out here in a client's garden to fill space, where it then fills space. This is Cheryl and Pierre Bennerup's, one of their wild areas in their acreage gardens with, boy, it might be hay-scented fern. I'm not sure which fern, but it's growing in with it is the phlox stolonifera and wood poppy, great ground cover, the three of them combined, along with geraniums. It's a interesting seed pod. That's what spits the seed around. Is unfortunately confused often with celandine poppy, and sometimes wood poppy is called celandine. This is a different species entirely. It's not a Stylophorum, it's a Chelidonium. It blooms yellow, but it is much weedier and not as good a ground cover. It does not keep things out. So here's our Stylophorum, the one we want to grow. This is the Chelidonium or the celandine poppy. You need to make sure that you're getting the one with the broader petals, and make sure you're buying Stylophorum. Go by the botanical name. There are some differences in the flower, but they're really hard to look at, hard to pick out and explain. Catmint, what a great ground cover. People say, oh, but it spreads around by seed. Well, a lot of ground covers do that. What's great about catmint is it grows in the sun, in dry areas, and if you cut it back after it blooms, which you can do with a weed whip, or you can do it and just chop it down with your head shears, it'll bloom again. And if you chop it again, it'll bloom a third time. And have that color is nice. So you'll see highway departments using it on the sides of the road. People say, oh, there's lavender. No, it's not lavender. That's catmint blooming. And so catmint is our ground cover here at the Detroit Zoo, another place where people walk all of the time and cut the corner, and the catmint managed to hold its own. This is catmint at a client's house where we had a big ground cover bed out front. It's turned into a perennial garden over time. Grows up, blooms, cut it back, blooms again, cut it back, it blooms again later in the year. And all of that is about 10 plants. Oh, looks like it's closer to 20 plants. I remember it as being 10 to start with. Okay, it does not grow in the shade well. You can put it in the part shade, but it's not going to have the same show or the same reblooming potential. It belongs in the sun. There are some very good dwarf ones with cute names like Perfect, Persian Beauty, and for as in P-U-R-R, purr, Cat's Meow, Cat's Pajamas. You want the shortest one you can get because then you have less to cut back. This is at our Detroit Zoo garden where we used it in the full sun, never watered area along with irises and mayapple as we got into the shade of this viburnum right here. Crown vetch. I don't tell people to plant crown vetch, but they have it already and want to know what to do with it. It was used a lot from the highway departments along the sides of roads. It was meant to hold the to control erosion. It doesn't control erosion well, but it does cover the ground well. It does give you a pink bloom. The pollinators do like it. So crown vetch. Daylilies are good. They're called ditch lilies because they were used by highway departments in the orange, just plain old orange runner type daylilies. Your better daylilies, the hybrid daylilies, form clumps. Yes, they expand, but they don't send a runner out 2 feet next to them and pop up. That's what the good ground cover daylilies do. I don't like to use them as a ground cover because there's so much to cut back. I'd rather use things that are shorter, that can lay down, and I don't have to look at them afterwards. But if you've got a tough place, like right along the road, daylilies are very salt tolerant. They're very good at filling space. The tighter they get, the more ground cover they get, the fewer flowers you get on them. But then if you're covering ground, that's what your intention is going to be. Most people don't think of Lenten rose, the hellebores hybrids, as a ground cover, but they can be. They are, because they're evergreen and those leaves stay until the next year and lay down flat on the ground. They cover the ground well, they keep other things out, and they can spread quite prolifically. And they grow in a lot of shade. There's several different kinds here with the bigger leaves, the bigger, more longer leaves of the fetidus and the bigger leaves of orientalis, and they hybridize. Here in Julie's garden, they've filled this whole area. They're behind the bench, they're around the bench. In the wintertime, then either you cut these leaves off in the spring before they bloom, or you look the other way, so that you're not looking at last year's leaves so much because here's the blooms coming already. But what they do, these hellebores, where you put them, and if you let them, is they seed themselves and spread around. They don't spread by clumps. So this one right here, which is one of the golden ones, Golden Sunrise, I think is its name, bulked up very quickly. So we took them and divided them. So you can spread it by dividing them. There's a division. This itself is a division where we cut the plant apart, but that's a separate plant. That's a separate plant. This one over here is a separate plant. So you can spread them around, or you can just let them go to seed. So here are the seedlings. And most of those seedlings end up getting killed each year as the new leaves come out and lay down on the ground. They shade out their own seedlings. But those that are beyond the plant, or those that are growing near a plant that's getting weak, have the chance to come up, and they do. Most of the time, your seedlings are not wonderful. You may have planted the yellow one, you may have planted an up-facing purple one, and what you're going to get as seedlings are a lot of different kinds of flowers, a lot of different variations on what you started with. But as a ground cover, that's not what you're really trying to get, is a particular flower. If you want a particular flower, then dig them up, as we've done here, and divide them into pieces so you have that flower. Mint. This is orange mint. We're using it as a ground cover at our Detroit Zoo garden. Never watered, never cared for, walked on, off and on regularly. Fills in very nicely. You can mow it down when it gets tall and starts laying down after it blooms, but it's a good ground cover, and it smells nice when people brush against it. Prairie dropseed or Sporobolus is a native grass. It's a prairie grass. This is it at Olbrich Botanical Gardens in Madison, Wisconsin. It's a native prairie plant, and it's a clump forming plant that does spread by seed. It does bloom in late June, so it comes up kind of slow in the springtime, which is nice because it means you can plant bulbs between it. Kind of comes up slow in the springtime, blooms late July. And when it blooms, if you walk through it, you'll smell buttered popcorn, which is a nice kind of thing to have. This is at Bob Creasy's, and he's growing it in part shade, which I didn't think of doing, but they do it all brick too, and it does well. We grow it out in the sun, Steve and I. Spiderwort is our native Tradescantia, native all across the whole East Coast from Virginia on up into Canada and all the way over to Missouri. Blue flowers, there are some red violet forms, and there's a white form. Kind of a daylily-ish looking foliage. This is one called Something Kate with gold leaves and darker flowers, quite attractive. I'm not sure if it's going to hold its own as a ground cover, pink flowers. Not particularly attractive after it goes to seed. After it's done blooming, it's kind of laying down all over the place. I tend to just take something and cut it back. There's liriope behind it here at this garden, and they mixed it up. But when the Tradescantia spiderwort lays down, I'll just cut it all the way to the ground if it's in a place where I'm looking at it and I don't want to see that, and it'll come back and bloom again quite often. Tavara, I talked about earlier as a good intermittent planting on earlier in the webinar about our friend David growing it on his hell strip. It's a native plant, which I learned is a polygonum, and now it's a persicaria. I've planted it here in a shade garden. Where are you? See, I know I planted it through here. I'm looking for its leaves. This is Thalictrum, and behind it is Tavara. Oh, there they are. There's Tavara in here, and in here, a variety called Painter's Palette. So these are our plants that we started with, and that's the first year that they're in. They come up and have a splash of color on them, which is a nice thing to have. Then they bloom with a pink flower that turns pretty quickly into a deep red seed pod. So they can, and this is fall, September, when they give you this show of color. This is the straight species, just green leafed. Nice plant to have, native. You'll find them at my nephew's house. He said, what are these things? He was worried that they were poison ivy. He said, no, you've got Tavara. You've got native Tavara showing up in here. There must be moisture in here because that's where they'll generally put themselves. Wood rush is something like a sedge, Luzula. So in a shady area, some of the sedges, a lot of the sedges are sunny, wet plants. Luzula is more for a woodland area. So here underneath birches. Perennial alyssum, we've added to the list on our list here. It's not on yours, but I realized, oh, there's one of my favorites not in there. It's a gray leafed, lays on the ground perennial that's evergreen, that blooms with very fragrant yellow flowers in the springtime, sometime in May, as the new foliage comes out. Old foliage, new foliage coming out. Will hang over the edge wherever it drops its seed. There you're going to have more plants. Belongs in the sun. Creeping St. John's wort, Hypericum calicinum, is a semi-evergreen, low to the ground, August blooming, good ground cover. We first saw it at, what is that garden? Bushart Gardens. And the dwarf Deutzias. Nico is the variety that we most often use. There are some that are a little bit taller, like Chardonnay bells or Chantilly bells. White flowers in the spring. These are its branches, which have kind of arched to the ground and are rooting and taking off. In the part shade and even into the full shade, this is a very good ground cover. You just don't want to have to walk through it because it is a woody plant that's arched up and down, which means that there's a whole bunch of little croquet hoops going to grab your feet as you walk by. So we're not going to take any questions because nobody's here but me right now. That's our take, and we'll make it chapter 3 of ground covers, so that if you want to hear about them, you can fast forward to the plant that you're looking for and hear what we have to say about it. Thanks a lot for bearing with us. And thanks a lot for being with us as a Garden A to Z reader or as a subscriber. That's it. Weekend Walkabout's done. Next week, Traveling Gardener, Smoky Mountains. Bye, all.